I still remember the exact moment the galaxy changed forever. Not the slow kind of change, not the kind that creeps in over centuries and lets you pretend things are the same. No, this was the kind that splits time into before and after, and I was sitting right at the center of it, too stunned to even open my mouth. My name is Vorath Seln. I am a senior diplomat of the Drethani people, and for 40 standard cycles I served on the Galactic Concord, the governing body of 312 spacefaring species. I thought I understood power. I thought I understood how the galaxy worked. I was wrong about everything. But let me take you back to the beginning, to the day when the first cracks appeared in a system we all believed was eternal. It started with an interruption. I was in the middle of a budget session, the kind of dull, procedural affair that makes even the most dedicated diplomat consider early retirement. 312 species, all crammed into a rotating chamber the size of a small moon, arguing about shipping lane tariffs. The Valith Dominion wanted a 12% increase on freight moving through their sectors. The Oravan Collective opposed it. Everyone else picked sides based on who owed favors to whom. The usual. I had been doing this for 4 decades, and I could have predicted every vote before the session even started. That was when a junior analyst named Korith burst through the chamber doors without authorization. Now, you need to understand something about the Concord. Protocol is sacred. You do not enter the main chamber without a scheduled appointment, a formal request filed in triplicate, and approval from at least 2 senior committee chairs. Korith had none of these. He was young, barely 30 cycles, with the pale blue skin of a lowland Drethani, and eyes so wide I could see the whites all the way from my seat in the 5th row. "Counselors," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Forgive the interruption. There has been a detection from the deep sensor array in Sector 41 null. A gravitational displacement. The mass signature does not match anything in our records." The chamber fell quiet, not the respectful quiet of polite attention, but the sudden, sharp silence that comes when something is wrong, and everyone feels it in their bones. I leaned forward. "What kind of mass signature?" Korith swallowed. "Large, Counselor. Very large. And it is moving." At the time, I did not grasp the significance. Sector 41 null was a dead zone, a stretch of empty space between 3 galactic arms where nothing of value existed, and no trade routes passed. An object moving through it could have been anything. An asteroid cluster, a rogue planetoid knocked loose by some distant gravitational event, a sensor ghost. But something about Korith's face told me it was none of those things. The session was suspended. It would never resume. I need to explain the galaxy as it was before that day, because you will not understand what came next without understanding what we had built and how thoroughly we believed in it. The Concord was not a democracy. It pretended to be, the way old institutions always pretend, but its true structure was a hierarchy built on a single principle. Military power determines political rank. Every species was classified into tiers, from Tier 1 at the top to Tier 9 at the bottom, and your tier determined everything: how many votes you carried, which committees you could sit on, where your ambassador's chair was placed in the chamber, whether anyone returned your messages. At the top sat 2 ancient powers, the Valith Dominion, a species of insectoid beings who had achieved spaceflight when most of the galaxy was still learning to use fire. Their fleets were legendary, planet-cracking dreadnoughts, 6 kilometers long, armed with weapons that could boil the oceans of a world in minutes. They had not used those weapons in 1,000 years, but they did not need to. The mere knowledge that such things existed was enough. Beside them stood the Oravan Collective, a hive mind species made of living silicon. They controlled 3 full galactic arms through sheer numbers and coordination. Their mobile hive stations, 12 kilometers across, served as both cities and warships. When the Oravan moved, entire sectors held their breath. Everyone else fell somewhere below, arranged by tonnage and technology and territory. My own people, the Drethani, sat at Tier 4, respectable, comfortable, safe. And then there were the humans. Humanity had been admitted to the Concord 11 standard cycles before the day I am describing. They arrived the way all newcomers arrived, with a single ship, a polite request for trade rights, and no idea how the game was really played. Their vessel was a frigate, a small, functional thing with a crew of about 200. It was clean and competently built, but nothing about it suggested a species that would ever matter. The Concord classified them as Tier 9, the lowest rung, the designation given to species that had barely mastered faster-than-light travel and posed no conceivable strategic relevance. Tier 9 species were tolerated, given a seat at the far back of the chamber, and largely ignored. Their ambassador was a woman named Eleanor Grant. I remember her clearly from those early days. She was neither tall nor particularly imposing by human standards. Brown hair, cut short, dark eyes that watched everything with an attentiveness that I mistook for nervousness. She wore simple clothes, spoke in measured sentences, and smiled frequently, in a way that seemed designed to put people at ease. I liked her, in the way that powerful beings like those who are harmless. She was pleasant, intelligent, certainly, but irrelevant. Every single cycle, without fail, Director Grant filed a formal petition requesting that humanity be reclassified to a higher tier, and every single cycle, the classification committee reviewed Earth's registered fleet, 48 corvettes, 12 frigates, and 2 light cruisers, compared it against the minimum thresholds, and denied the petition. The process took about 10 minutes. No one gave it a second thought. I personally signed 3 of those denials. I did not feel guilty about it at the time. The system was the system. Rules existed for a reason. Humanity simply had not earned a higher rank. That was what I told myself. I recall one particular reception, held after the 7th denial. The Valith hosted these events in their orbital palace, a sprawling structure of black glass and bioengineered coral that floated above their homeworld like a dark crown. I found Director Grant standing alone near one of the observation windows, a glass of untouched Fulani wine in her hand, watching the stars. "Director," I said, because I was feeling generous that evening, "I hope the committee's decision has not discouraged you." She turned to me and smiled. That same calm, patient smile. "Not at all, Counselor. We understand the process. These things take time." "Indeed they do," I agreed, pleased by her maturity. "We are patient people," she added, and then she looked back at the stars. "I thought nothing of it. I should have thought everything of it. Because what I did not know, what none of us knew, was that every single petition, every polite request, every gracious acceptance of denial, was a calculated move in a strategy that had been running since the day humanity set foot in the Concord, and by the time we understood what that strategy was, it was already too late. Now, back to Korath and his trembling report. Within 6 hours of the initial detection, the Concord sensor network had triangulated the anomaly. It was not a ghost. It was not an asteroid. It was a single object, roughly cylindrical, and it was moving at a velocity that suggested controlled propulsion rather than drift. The mass readings were preliminary but already troubling. Whatever this thing was, it was big. The Senior Security Council convened in closed session. 12 species, the most powerful in the Concord, gathered around a hollow table in a chamber that most beings never even knew existed. I was not a member of the Security Council, but I was invited as a neutral observer, due to my long tenure and the Drethani reputation for measured judgment. Overmind Sithron of the Valith Dominion sat at the head of the table, as was customary. He was enormous, even by Valith standards. A thorax as wide as a shuttle, mandibles that could shear through hull plating, and compound eyes that reflected the room in 1,000 fractured images. He spoke rarely, but when he did, the room listened. "What is the object's trajectory?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant clicking. The sensor chief, a small Fulani named Talith, projected the data. "It is moving along a direct line toward Sector 41, Null's geometric center, Overmind. At current velocity, it will arrive within 32 hours. Geometric center," repeated the Oravan representative, a flickering column of crystallized silicon that pulsed with each word. "That is the exact center of Concord-administered space." "Correct." A murmur ran through the room. The center of Concord space was not a significant military position. There were no stations there, no planets, no resources, but it was symbolically important. The center was neutral ground. No species claimed it. To move a vessel of unknown origin to that exact point was either a coincidence or a message. I did not believe in coincidences. "Increase scanning resolution," Sithran ordered. "I want to know what this thing is before it arrives." We had 32 hours. In those 32 hours, I did not sleep. I do not think anyone did. Reports came in every few minutes, each one more confusing than the last. The object's mass readings kept climbing as our instruments refined their measurements. First, it was estimated to be equivalent to a standard heavy cruiser, then a dreadnought, then something beyond any vessel classification the Concorde had ever established. The atmosphere in the station changed. I could feel it in the way people moved through the corridors, in the hushed conversations that stopped when certain officials walked past, in the way junior staff kept checking their personal comm devices as though expecting an alert that would explain everything. Nobody could explain anything, and that, more than the readings themselves, was what frightened me. The Concorde was built on the assumption that we had cataloged every significant military force in the galaxy. Our sensor networks covered 98% of inhabited space. Our intelligence services had operatives in every major government. We knew the precise count of every fleet, every warship, every weapons platform belonging to every species. And yet here was something that none of our systems had predicted, approaching the center of our civilization, and we had no idea what it was. 20 hours before arrival, I found Director Grant in the diplomatic commissary. She was eating breakfast, alone as usual, at the small table assigned to Tier 9 representatives, a bowl of something that humans called oatmeal, a cup of black coffee. I sat down across from her without asking permission. She looked up and offered me that familiar smile. "Good morning, Counselor." "Director, I assume you are aware of the situation in Sector 41 Null." "I have heard some rumors," she said. "A sensor anomaly, is it not?" "It is rather more than that." She took a sip of her coffee. "I am sure the Council has it well in hand." I studied her face. I had spent 40 cycles reading the expressions and body language of dozens of species. I was good at it. And in that moment, sitting across from Eleanor Grant in the quiet of the commissary, I felt something I could not name. Not suspicion exactly, not fear. Something closer to the feeling you get when you look at a familiar landscape and realize that one of the hills is not a hill at all, but something that has been sitting there so long you stop seeing it. "Director," I said carefully, "is there anything you wish to tell me?" She set down her coffee and met my eyes. Her expression was perfectly pleasant, perfectly composed, and absolutely unreadable. "Not at this time, Counselor, but I appreciate you asking." She returned to her oatmeal. I left the commissary feeling more unsettled than when I had entered. Something was very wrong, and I could not figure out what it was. The answer was right in front of me, sitting at a small table, eating breakfast, and smiling. I just could not see it yet. The Concorde's Strategic Observation Hall had not been used at full capacity in over 300 cycles. It was built during the last great galactic crisis, a territorial dispute between the Valith and the Oravan that had nearly escalated to open conflict before diplomatic intervention pulled both sides back from the edge. The hall was a massive amphitheater carved into the core of the station, with seating for every species representative and a holographic display system capable of projecting real-time sensor data across a curved screen nearly a kilometer wide. When I entered the hall, every single seat was occupied. 312 species, thousands of representatives, and the room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The holographic display showed a live feed from the deep-range telescopes focused on Sector 41 Null. For the first 12 hours, the feed had shown nothing but empty space, black and featureless. But the instruments had continued to refine their readings, and the mass estimates had continued to climb. And somewhere in the last few hours, the optical systems had finally achieved sufficient resolution to render a visual. What appeared on that screen changed the galaxy forever. It was a ship. I say that word and it feels inadequate, like calling an ocean a puddle. Every spacefaring civilization builds vessels of war. I had seen thousands of them in my career. Valith dreadnoughts, sleek and predatory, their hulls black as the void between stars. Orivon hive stations, vast and geometric, humming with the collective consciousness of millions. Drathani patrol cruisers, compact and efficient, designed for speed rather than spectacle. What I saw on the screen was something else entirely. The vessel was angular, hard lines and sharp edges where galactic convention favored curves and flowing surfaces. It was armored in layered plates of a material I had never seen before, something dark and dense that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, so the ship appeared less like an object in space, and more like a hole cut in the fabric of the stars. It was studded with protrusions that our weapons analysts could not categorize, arrays and emitters and turrets of unfamiliar design, arranged in geometric patterns across its hull. Running lights traced lines along its surface, precise and deliberate, and I realized with a chill that those lines were not decorative, they were targeting grids. The entire exterior of the ship was a weapons system. But the thing that silenced the room, the thing that made 312 species collectively hold their breath, was the size. The Concorde's measurement systems struggled with it at first. The initial reading was 12 kilometers, then 15. Then, as the full length of the vessel cleared the sensor shadow of a nearby dust cloud, the number settled and held. 19 kilometers. 19 kilometers long. A single warship. The largest Valith dreadnought was 6. The mightiest Orevan hive station was 12. This thing was nearly twice the size of anything that had ever been built by any species in the recorded history of the galaxy. The room erupted with noise. 312 species all began speaking at once. A roar of voices and frequencies and harmonics that crashed against the stone walls of the amphitheater like a wave. I could hear the clicking of Valith mandibles, the harmonic pulses of the Orevan, the shrill whistles of the Filani, and beneath it all, the lower, steadier murmur of dozens of species I could not immediately identify. Fear has a universal sound, regardless of biology. That sound filled the hall. I did not speak. I could not. I sat in my seat, my claws gripping the armrests, and stared at the screen, at the impossible shape hanging in the void. Then the identification system locked on. Every vessel in the galaxy carries a transponder signal, a coded broadcast that identifies species of origin, vessel name, and classification. The Concorde systems are designed to detect and decode these signals automatically. It took longer than usual with this ship, because the encryption protocols were unfamiliar, but the system eventually found a match. The data resolved on the main display, projected in characters 3 meters tall for the entire amphitheater to see. Species of origin, Terran Federation. Vessel designation, TFW-001 Hercules. Class, Titan. The noise stopped. Not gradually, not like a crowd settling down. It stopped, as though someone had reached into the room and physically removed all sound. I have never experienced silence like that, not before and not since. 312 species, thousands of beings, and for 5 full seconds, not one of them made a sound. Then Overmind Cithron rose to his full height, his thorax plates flaring, and his voice cut through the silence like a blade through cloth. Humans. That single word carried a weight I cannot adequately describe. It was not a question. It was not a statement of surprise. It was the sound of a being who had ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years, confronting the possibility that he might not rule it for much longer. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I had witnessed in 4 decades of galactic diplomacy. The Valith delegation surged to their feet, mandibles clicking in rapid communication patterns that my translator struggled to keep up with. The Orevan representative's crystalline form pulsed with colors I had never seen before, broadcasting distress signals on frequencies that made my teeth ache. 3 separate delegations from smaller species attempted to leave the hall and had to be physically prevented by station security. 1 Tier 7 ambassador, a large fungal being from a species whose name I am embarrassed to say I never learned, simply fainted. And through all of it, I found my gaze drawn to a single figure. Row 97. The highest, farthest row in the amphitheater, the section reserved for Tier 9 species, the back of the room, where the unimportant sit. Director Eleanor Grant had not moved from her chair. She had not stood. She had not spoken. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight, her expression composed. From my seat in the 5th row, I could barely make out her features, but even across that distance, across nearly 100 rows of screaming, panicking representatives, I could see her eyes. She was watching, not the screen, not the ship. She was watching the room, watching us, and there was something in her stillness, in the absolute calm of her posture amid the storm of 312 species losing their collective composure, that told me everything I needed to know. She had known all along. Our eyes met across the vast amphitheater, a reptilian diplomat in the 5th row and a human ambassador in the 97th. 40 cycles of experience on one side, 11 years of patient, deliberate silence on the other. She smiled. And then the second transponder ping registered. The sensor officer, a Fulani whose name I would later learn was Lieutenant Mavis, was the first to notice. I watched her feathers stand upright along her neck, a Fulani threat response that they cannot consciously control. She turned to the main console, checked the reading, checked it again, and then spoke in a voice that was entirely too quiet for the size of the room. Counselors. The hall was still in chaos. Nobody heard her. Counselors, she said again, louder. Overmind Sithran turned his massive head. Speak. Mavis looked at the display, then at the amphitheater. Her beak opened and closed twice before she managed words. The Hercules is not alone. We are detecting additional gravitational displacements emerging from hyperspace fold along a trailing formation vector. 5 additional contacts, same mass signature, same classification. The silence returned, heavier this time. Absolute. There are 6 of them, Mavis said, and her voice broke on the last word. 6 Titan-class warships. They were positioned directly behind the first vessel, using its mass shadow to mask their sensor profiles. They are now spreading into formation. I looked at the screen. Where there had been one impossible shape, there were now 6, fanning out across the void like the fingers of an opening hand. 6 vessels, each 19 kilometers long, each bristling with weapons that our best analysts could not identify, each carrying a transponder that broadcast the same 2 words over and over. Terran Federation, Terran Federation, Terran Federation. 6 times. I turned back to row 97. Eleanor Grant was still sitting in her chair, still watching the room with that calm, measured gaze. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She did not need to. The room understood. In that moment, as I sat in the strategic observation hall surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy, all of whom were either shouting or stunned into silence, I felt something I had not felt in decades. It started as a cold sensation in my chest, spread through my limbs and settled behind my eyes like a weight. It was fear, real, primal, undeniable fear, not of the ships, though they were terrifying, not of their weapons, though those were beyond anything we had imagined. I was afraid, because I suddenly understood that the galaxy I had known, the careful hierarchy of power and prestige that I had spent my entire career navigating and defending, had been built on a foundation of assumption. We had assumed we knew who was powerful and who was not. We had assumed that a species with 48 corvettes and 12 frigates was exactly what it appeared to be. We had assumed that 11 years of polite requests and patient smiles meant acceptance, contentment, submission. We had been wrong. About all of it. And the woman in row 97 had been counting on exactly that. The emergency session of the Senior Security Council convened 40 minutes after the 6th Titan-class warship completed its emergence from hyperspace. I was escorted to the closed chamber by 2 Valith guards whose mandibles had not stopped clicking since the revelation. The sound was unsettling, a rapid, involuntary stress response that even the most disciplined Valith soldiers cannot fully suppress. If the guards were afraid, then the situation was worse than I thought. Valith do not frighten easily. The chamber was a sphere of polished dark stone, suspended at the station's core by magnetic clamps. There were no windows. Sound-dampening fields lined every surface. What was said in this room stayed in this room. That was not tradition. That was physics. The 12 senior representatives were already seated when I arrived. Overmind Sithran occupied the central position, his massive form curled into the reinforced chair that had been custom-built for Valith anatomy. Beside him, the Oravan representative flickered and pulsed, its crystalline surface throwing fractured light across the walls. The remaining 10 seats held representatives from the most powerful Tier 2 and Tier 3 civilizations, beings who collectively controlled roughly 60% of the galaxy's military forces and 70% of its economic output. I took my chair at the edge of the room. My role was to observe and advise, nothing more. "Begin," said Sithran. The Concord's chief intelligence officer, a wiry Drathani named Sethal who had held the position for 22 cycles, stood and activated the central holo display. His hands were steady, but his tail, which Drathani cannot consciously control, was coiled tight against his leg. He was terrified. In the 48 hours since the initial detection, Sethal began, my division has conducted a comprehensive review of all intelligence holdings related to the Terran Federation. What we have found is deeply concerning, not because of what the humans have done, but because of what we failed to see. He brought up a star chart. Earth's registered territory was highlighted in blue. A small patch of space, barely visible on the galactic scale. 2 colonized worlds. A modest orbital infrastructure. Exactly what you would expect from a Tier 9 civilization. Then Sethal pressed a control, and the map changed. 17 additional star systems appeared, scattered across 3 galactic arms, each one highlighted in a deep, pulsing red. My stomach dropped. These systems, Sethal said, were surveyed and settled by the Terran Federation over the past 11 years. They were selected with extraordinary precision. Every one of them was classified in Concord records as resource poor, either depleted mining zones, unstable orbital environments, or systems too far from major trade routes to justify development. As a result, none of them were ever audited. None of them appeared on any intelligence watch list. None of them were monitored by deep sensor arrays. He paused to let the implications settle, but they did not need time to settle. They landed immediately, like a hammer on glass. Within these 17 systems, the Terran Federation has constructed a complete military-industrial infrastructure. Orbital shipyards concealed within asteroid fields, research stations embedded in the upper atmospheres of gas giants, manufacturing facilities built into the cores of dead moons, and a civilian population spread across 9 fully colonized worlds, totaling approximately 14 billion human beings. The room erupted, not with the broad panic of the amphitheater, but with the sharp, focused fury of powerful beings who have just been told that they have been outmaneuvered. 14 billion, repeated the representative from the Corvan Union, a Tier 2 mammalian species known for their analytical minds. That is more than twice the population of our own homeworld. How is this possible? How were they not detected? Because we were not looking, Sethal answered, and the honesty in his voice was almost painful. The Terran Federation's registered fleet consisted of 48 corvettes, 12 frigates, and 2 light cruisers. All real, all maintained at specifications, consistent with a Tier 9 classification. Every inspection we conducted confirmed their fleet status exactly as reported. We never questioned it because the numbers matched our expectations. Their fleet was a screen, Zithran said. Not a question. Yes, Overmind. A deliberate screen. A force maintained at precisely the level required to satisfy our audits while drawing no additional attention. Meanwhile, their actual military development occurred entirely outside registered territory, in systems we had no reason to observe. I sat in my chair and felt the pieces falling into place with a precision that was almost nauseating. Every detail, every interaction, every small moment I had shared with Eleanor Grant over the past 11 years, replayed in my mind with new clarity. The polite petitions, the patient smiles, the quiet acceptance of every denial. She had wanted to be denied. Every petition filed was not a genuine attempt at reclassification. It was a performance designed to reinforce our own assumptions. As long as humanity kept asking nicely and kept getting turned down, the Council had no reason to look more closely. The petitions were not requests. They were camouflage. Sethal continued. Our technical analysis of the Titan-class vessels is still preliminary, but the initial findings are significant. These ships do not appear to be based on reverse-engineered galactic technology. The Terran Federation had access to our standard technical databases, the same information shared with all Concord member species. But rather than copying existing designs, they appear to have studied the underlying principles, identified the theoretical limitations that our own engineers had accepted as permanent, and then systematically found ways past those limitations. He projected a comparison chart. On one side, the shield harmonics of a standard Valith dreadnought, the most advanced defensive technology in the known galaxy. On the other side, the estimated shield harmonics of a Titan-class warship. The human readings were not slightly better. They were not incrementally improved. They were 2 full generations ahead, operating on principles that our physicists had published theoretical papers about, and then dismissed as impractical for real-world application. The humans had made them practical. Their weapons systems are equally advanced, Sethal said. We cannot fully categorize them from sensor data alone, but energy output readings suggest capabilities that exceed anything currently deployed by any Concord member species, including Tier 1 powers. The room was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone present is doing the same mental calculation and arriving at the same answer. Sithron broke the silence. Tactical assessment. If the combined Valith and Orevan fleets were to engage these vessels, what would be the outcome? The chief strategist, a small, elderly Filani, named Counselor Dren, whose feathers had long since faded from their original brilliant blue to a soft gray, stepped forward. Dren had served as the Concord's senior military strategist for 30 cycles. She had planned campaigns, resolved territorial disputes, and assessed threat levels for half the species in the galaxy. She was not given to exaggeration or panic. She spoke in a calm, measured tone that somehow made her words worse. Based on energy output analysis, defensive capability estimates, and the tactical advantages inherent in operating 6 vessels of this tonnage in coordinated formation, my assessment is as follows. A single Titan-class warship could engage the combined Valith-Orevan fleet. The outcome would be uncertain. Losses on both sides would be severe. However, 6 Titan-class warships operating together represent a force concentration that the current galactic order has no credible military counter for. Any offensive action against the Terran Federation at this time would result in the effective elimination of the attacking force. She paused, and then added, with the quiet precision of someone delivering a mathematical proof, we cannot threaten these ships. We cannot match them. And given what we now know about the industrial capacity of the Terran Federation's 17 hidden systems, we cannot outbuild them in any relevant time frame. The strategic reality is that humanity has achieved unilateral military superiority, and they have done so without firing a single weapon or violating a single law. That last sentence hung in the air like smoke. Zithron's mandibles clicked rapidly, the Valith equivalent of a human clenching their jaw. They have violated the founding accords, undeclared colonies, undeclared military assets, undisclosed population expansion. These are grounds for sanctions, expulsion, and military intervention under Article 12. I saw Dren and Sethal exchange a glance. It was brief, barely a flicker, but I caught it, and in that glance, I read something that turned my blood cold. They already knew the answer to this argument, and it was not the answer Sithran wanted. It was Sethal who spoke. Overmind. My division consulted with the Concord's legal scholars before this session. The founding accords do require disclosure of military assets and territorial holdings. However, this requirement is triggered specifically at the point of formal tier reclassification review, as outlined in Article 7, Section 3. He brought up the relevant text on the holo display. 3,000 years of galactic law, written in the dense formal language of the original founding species, and buried in it, a single clause that no one had ever considered significant. The Terran Federation filed formal requests for tier reclassification review, 11 times over the past 11 years. Each request was denied without a formal review being conducted. Under the strict language of the Accords, the disclosure obligation does not activate until a review is granted. Since no review was ever granted, the Terran Federation was under no legal obligation to disclose. He paused. They did not break our laws, Overmind. They used them, precisely as written. Zithran was very still. The kind of stillness that, in a Valith, indicates either deep thought or impending action. The room waited. Then change the law, he said. That would require a full council vote, I heard myself saying, and every head in the room turned toward me. I had not planned to speak, but the words came out regardless, driven by a part of my mind that was already several steps ahead. A retroactive change to the founding accords would require a 2/3 majority of all member species, and I suspect, Overmind, that if you attempt such a vote today, you will not like the result. Sithron's compound eyes fixed on me. Explain. Humanity has just demonstrated that a Tier 9 species can rise to challenge Tier 1 powers. There are 246 species in this Concord classified Tier 5 or below. Many of them have harbored grievances about the classification system for centuries. If you attempt to use the law to punish humanity for doing what every lower-tier species has dreamed of doing, you will not find 246 allies. You will find 246 enemies. The room was silent for a long moment. Then a communication request appeared on the central console. A formal diplomatic hail from the Hercules. From the Terran Federation. From Eleanor Grant. I authorized the connection. Her face appeared on the holo display, composed and calm, as though she were requesting a routine meeting, rather than addressing the 12 most powerful beings in the galaxy from the bridge of a warship that had just rewritten the balance of power. Senior Security Council, she said. The Terran Federation requests an emergency session of the full Galactic Concord to discuss the reclassification of humanity within the existing framework of the Founding Accords. We believe our current Tier 9 designation is no longer reflective of our actual capabilities and contributions. She paused. Her dark eyes found the camera with perfect precision. We have been asking politely for 11 years. We would very much appreciate the opportunity to have a proper conversation this time. Zethron's mandibles went still. The Orivon's crystalline form dimmed. Nobody spoke. I looked at the face on the screen, at the woman I had sat across from at diplomatic receptions, whose petitions I had signed away without a second thought, whose patience I had mistaken for weakness, and whose silence I had mistaken for insignificance. For the first time in 40 cycles, I had no idea what was going to happen next, and I realized, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this was exactly where Eleanor Grant had wanted me to be all along. The full Concord assembled the following morning. I had been appointed mediator for the emergency session, a role I accepted with a calm exterior and a churning interior. The Drethani are considered neutral among the major power blocks, and my long tenure gave me credibility with most factions. But the truth was simpler than politics. No one else wanted the job. Every other senior diplomat who had been approached had found urgent reasons to decline. I could not blame them. Mediating a session that might reshape the galaxy was not a career opportunity. It was a career-ending risk. The chamber was configured differently than usual. The standard circular seating arrangement, where delegations sat according to tier, had been maintained, but the atmosphere had changed. The lower tiers, species accustomed to sitting quietly and voting as they were told, were animated in a way I had never seen. Small clusters of ambassadors from Tier 6, 7, and 8 civilizations huddled together in the corridors outside the chamber, speaking in urgent whispers. Representatives who had never exchanged more than formal pleasantries were suddenly holding intense conversations. Something was moving through the lower tiers, a current of energy that I could feel but could not yet name. I stood at the central podium and called the session to order. 312 species fell silent. The holographic display behind me showed the live sensor feed of 6 Titan-class warships holding position in the geometric center of Concord space. The image was impossible to ignore. That was, I suspected, the entire point. The main doors opened, and Eleanor Grant entered the chamber. She did not enter from row 97. She walked in from the main floor entrance, flanked by 2 Terran military officers in black dress uniforms. One was a tall man with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, whom she introduced as Admiral Henry Carr. The other was a younger woman with red hair pulled back tight, identified as Commander Catherine Moore. Both stood with the easy, controlled posture of people who had spent their lives in service and were entirely comfortable with the weight of the moment. Director Grant carried nothing. No notes, no datapad, no prepared remarks. She walked to the speaker's platform, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at 312 species with the same expression I had seen 100 times before. Calm, attentive, and completely in control. The chamber was so quiet that I could hear the hum of the station's gravity generators. "Members of the Galactic Concord," she began. "My name is Eleanor Grant. I am the senior diplomatic representative of the Terran Federation. I stand before you today not to make demands, and not to issue threats. I am here to tell you a story, our story, the one we have been living for the past 11 years while this chamber was not watching." She paused, not for drama, for breath. And then she continued. 11 years ago, humanity entered the galactic community for the first time. We came with open hands and genuine hope. We had dreamed of the stars for all of our history, and when we finally reached them, we expected to find what our stories had always promised, a vast civilization built on cooperation, on mutual respect, on the shared recognition that every thinking species has value. Her voice was steady, conversational, almost. She was not performing. She was explaining. What we found instead was a hierarchy, a system in which a species' worth is measured by the tonnage of its warships and the reach of its territory. A system in which newcomers are classified, categorized, and assigned a rank that determines everything: their political influence, their economic opportunities, their basic dignity within these halls. We were given Tier 9, the lowest classification, and we were told, in terms both polite and absolute, that this was where we belonged. A ripple of discomfort passed through the upper-tier delegations. The Valith shifted in their seats. The Corvan exchanged glances.
We studied this system carefully,
Eleanor continued.
We studied its rules. We studied its history.
We studied the species that sat at the top and the species that sat at the bottom. And we asked ourselves a question that I suspect many in this room have asked at some point during their own histories. Is this system designed to organize, or is it designed to control? No one answered. The question did not require an answer. It required honesty, and honesty is harder. We concluded that the tier system, whatever its original intent, has become a mechanism for maintaining the existing distribution of power. Species at the top remain at the top because the rules are written to keep them there. Species at the bottom remain at the bottom because the system provides no realistic path upward. Petitions for reclassification are reviewed by committees dominated by upper-tier representatives. Appeals are heard by councils whose members have a direct interest in denying advancement. The process is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. I watched the reactions across the chamber. The upper tiers were stone-faced, guarded, defensive, but the lower tiers were leaning forward, listening, hearing their own experiences reflected in the words of a species that had, until yesterday, been as marginal as any of them. Humanity made a decision, Eleanor said. We would not fight this system from within, because fighting from within is what the system is designed to absorb. We would not protest, because protests are easy to ignore when you have no power behind them. Instead, we would build, quietly, patiently, thoroughly. We would develop our own capabilities to a level that could not be denied, and then we would present the Concord with a simple reality. We are not what you assumed we were, and the assumptions themselves are the problem. She looked directly at Overmind Sithran. The Valith leader sat motionless, his compound eyes reflecting her image in 1,000 facets. In the past 11 years, the Terran Federation has settled 17 star systems. We have colonized 9 worlds. Our population has grown to 14 billion. We have constructed a military and industrial capacity that, according to your own analysts, exceeds the combined output of any single Tier 1 power. She let that number sit in the room for a moment. 14 billion. A population that had been invisible to the most extensive intelligence apparatus in the galaxy, not because it was hidden by advanced technology or exotic countermeasures, but because no one had thought to look. We did all of this, she continued, without violating a single provision of the founding accords. We filed for reclassification review every year, as required. When those reviews were denied, we accepted the decision. Under the clear language of Article 7, Section 3, our disclosure obligations were not triggered because no review was ever conducted. We followed your laws to the letter. We simply took them more seriously than you did. Sithran's mandibles began to click, but Eleanor raised a hand, not in command, in request, and the Overmind, leader of the most powerful military force in galactic history, stopped. I am not here to embarrass this council, she said. I am not here to humiliate anyone. I am here because for 11 years I sat in row 97 and watched species that should have had a voice in this chamber sit in silence because the system told them their voice did not matter. I am here because the tier system does not just hold humanity down. It holds dozens of civilizations down. Species with brilliant scientists, gifted artists, profound philosophers, all reduced to a number on a classification chart because they do not have enough warships. She stepped away from the podium and stood in the open floor, facing the full assembly. The Terran Federation is formally requesting tier reclassification. But more than that, we are requesting a comprehensive review of the tier system itself, not to destroy it, not to replace it with chaos, but to reform it into something that reflects what this Concord should have always been, a community of equals, where a species' value is measured by more than its capacity for destruction. Silence. A vast, ringing silence that filled every corner of the enormous chamber. And then, from the upper rows, from the sections where the lower-tier species sat in chairs that were smaller and less comfortable than those on the main floor, a single voice spoke. The Felani support the Terran Federation's request. I turned. Counselor Talith, the small avian diplomat who had served as censor chief during the initial detection, had risen from her seat. Her feathers were raised, the Felani display of conviction, and her voice carried across the chamber with a clarity that belied her size. The Felani have petitioned for reclassification for 600 years. 600 years of being told we do not meet the criteria. 600 years of watching our contributions to science, art, and diplomacy count for nothing because our fleet is small. If humanity's emergence forces this council to confront the injustice of the system it has built, then the Felani stand with them. Another voice, then another, the Corvan Union, the Dren Collective, the Tessari, the Velthan, species I had worked alongside for decades, species I had considered satisfied with their positions, stood one by one and spoke the same word: support. The lower tiers were not just listening, they were choosing, and they were choosing humanity. Cithron finally spoke, his voice cutting through the growing chorus. This is a power grab, nothing more. The humans build weapons in secret and then present themselves as reformers. This council should not be deceived. Eleanor turned to face him. Overmind, with the deepest respect, every power in this room achieved its position through military strength. The Valith Dominion did not rise to Tier 1 through diplomacy. You rose through the construction of warships that made resistance impractical. We have simply done the same thing. The difference is that we are asking this council to move beyond that paradigm, not to reinforce it. The Valith delegation demanded a vote to declare humanity's actions a threat to galactic stability. It was the procedural weapon they had used for centuries to suppress challenges to their authority. A simple majority was all that was required, and the upper tiers had always been able to assemble one through a combination of genuine support and political pressure. The vote was called. I presided, tallying the results as they came in from each delegation. The motion failed. For the first time in the recorded history of the Galactic Concord, a Valith-sponsored security motion did not achieve a majority. The lower-tier species, voting as a bloc, overwhelmed the upper tiers through sheer numbers. The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of shock or fear, the silence of something old and rigid beginning to crack. Eleanor Grant returned to the podium for her closing statement. She spoke for less than a minute. We did not build the Hercules to conquer anyone. We did not build it to threaten anyone. We built it because in 11 years of sitting in this chamber, we learned that no one in this room would listen to us without it, and that is the truth this council needs to sit with. Not what humanity has done, but what it says about this institution that we had to do it. She stepped down from the platform. Admiral Carr and Commander Moore fell into step beside her. They walked back toward the main entrance, and as they passed row 97, Eleanor paused. She looked up at the empty chair where she had sat for 11 years, patient and smiling, filing petitions she knew would be denied, watching a galaxy that refused to see her. Then she turned and walked out through the main doors. I stood at the podium, looking out at 312 species sitting in stunned silence, and I understood something that I think Eleanor Grant had understood from the very first day she walked into this chamber. Power is not what you carry. It is what others believe you are willing to use, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait until the right moment to show them what you were carrying all along. 6 standard months had passed since the emergence. That is what they called it now. Not the crisis, not the incident, the emergence. As if humanity had always been there, just below the surface, and had simply chosen this moment to step into the light. I sat in my private quarters aboard the Concorde station, at the same desk where I had written diplomatic briefings and policy recommendations for 4 decades, But I was not writing policy anymore. I was writing my memoirs. Not because I believed my perspective was uniquely important, but because someone needed to record what it felt like to be standing in the room when the future arrived uninvited and sat down at the table. The galaxy had changed. I could see it in 1,000 small ways. The corridors of the station felt different. Lower-tier diplomats walked with their heads higher. Conversations that had once been whispered were now spoken aloud. Junior staff from species that had never contributed to policy discussions were submitting proposals, requesting committee assignments, filing motions. The old deference, the quiet acceptance that the galaxy was arranged as it should be, had evaporated like water on hot stone. The Concord had voted on humanity's reclassification 3 months after the emergency session. The debate lasted 11 days. The Valith fought it at every stage, deploying procedural challenges, demanding amendments, calling for independent reviews. The Oravon, more pragmatic by nature, eventually broke with the Valith position and abstained, which was the closest the collective ever came to admitting that the wind had changed direction. The final vote created something unprecedented. Humanity was not classified as Tier 2, which the Valith had lobbied for with the transparent aim of keeping humans one rank below themselves, nor were they classified as Tier 1, which raw military assessment would have justified. Instead, a new designation was established, one that had never existed in the 4,000-year history of the Concord. Tier 0, Foundational Power. The designation was Eleanor Grant's suggestion, and she insisted that it carry obligations rather than just privileges. Tier 0 meant a seat on every major committee. It meant veto authority on military actions, but it also meant mandatory investment in lower-tier development programs, compulsory technology sharing with species below Tier 5, and a binding commitment to participate in galactic peacekeeping operations. Eleanor did not want humanity to simply replace the Valith at the top of the hierarchy. She wanted the hierarchy itself to begin dissolving. The tier system was now under formal review for the first time since its creation. A reform commission had been established, chaired jointly by a human delegate and a representative from the Phalani. I thought about Counselor Talith, the small avian diplomat who had been the first to stand in support of humanity during the emergency session. 600 years her species had been petitioning for recognition. 600 years of being told they were not enough. And now she sat at the head of a commission that would decide the future of the very system that had held her people down. I served on the commission. I had volunteered. Not because I felt guilty, although I did. Not because I wanted to make amends, although I did. But because I had spent 40 cycles believing that I understood how the galaxy worked, and Eleanor Grant had shown me that I did not understand anything at all. The least I could do was help build something better. The 6 Titan-class warships had dispersed after the vote. 2 remained in Concord space, holding position at equidistant points along the main trade corridors. Their presence was not aggressive. They did not interfere with shipping or patrol routes. They simply existed, vast and dark and quiet. And their existence was enough. Piracy along the main corridors, which had been a persistent problem for centuries, dropped by 60% within the first month. Not because the Titans pursued pirates. They did not need to. A 19-kilometer warship does not chase smugglers. It simply reminds everyone within sensor range that the rules have changed. The other 4 Titans moved to the galactic rim. The rim was the galaxy's open wound, the lawless border region where Concord authority thinned to nothing, and predatory species, rogue factions, and opportunistic warlords had terrorized unprotected civilizations for as long as anyone could remember. Dozens of species lived on the rim, too far from the galactic core to benefit from Concord protection, too weak to defend themselves. They had been asking for help for centuries. The upper-tier powers had always found reasons to decline. The rim was too far. The logistics were too complex. The cost was too high. There was always a reason. Humanity did not need a reason. They just went. Within 3 months of the Titans' arrival on the rim, attacks on unprotected settlements had dropped by 94%. I will say that number again because it deserves to be heard clearly. 94%. The Titans did not fire their weapons. They did not engage in combat. They simply arrived. 4 impossible shapes spreading across the rim like sentinels, and the predators who had hunted those spaces for generations looked at them and decided, quietly, that it was time to find a different line of work. I received reports from Rim-world leaders. Many of them were species so small and remote that I had never heard their names before. They spoke of the Titan crews with a kind of stunned gratitude that I found difficult to read without emotion. One leader, the elected head of a species of aquatic beings who had lost 3 colony ships to raiders in the past decade alone, described seeing the Hercules appear above her world for the first time. She said her people had a legend about great creatures that slept in the deep ocean and rose to protect the weak when the waters grew dangerous. She said she had always thought it was just a story. She did not think that anymore. I visited the Hercules myself, 3 months after the emergence, at the personal invitation of its commanding officer, Admiral Henry Carr. I had met Carr briefly during the emergency session, where he had stood beside Eleanor Grant in his black uniform and said nothing. He was a man of few words and considerable presence, with a handshake that communicated more than most diplomats managed in an hour of speech. I remember the shuttle approach. The Hercules was holding position above a Concorde resupply station, its hull filling the viewport like a landscape rather than a vessel. I had seen the ship on sensor displays and holographic projections, but seeing it with my own eyes was a fundamentally different experience. The scale was incomprehensible. My shuttle flew along the ship's ventral surface for nearly 12 minutes before reaching the docking bay, and during that time I could see nothing but hull plating, dark and layered and featureless, stretching in every direction like the ground of a world turned upside down. Inside, the Hercules was not what I expected. I had imagined something cold, something purely functional, all metal corridors and weapon systems, a machine built for a single purpose. What I found was a city. The ship's interior was organized into districts. There were residential sections with parks and gardens and artificial sunlight. There were research labs, manufacturing facilities, schools, medical centers, and recreational spaces. There was a library that contained, according to Commander Moore, who served as my guide, the complete cultural archives of the Terran Federation. Every book, every piece of music, every scientific paper, every work of art that humanity had ever produced. We did not build a warship, Commander Moore explained as we walked through a corridor lined with windows that looked out into a hydroponic bay the size of a stadium. We built a world that can defend itself. There is a difference. But what struck me most was not the architecture or the technology. It was the crew. I had expected humans, and there were humans, thousands of them, moving through the corridors with the purposeful efficiency of people who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. But they were not alone. As we walked through the operations center, I saw Fulani officers working at navigation consoles, their small, precise hands moving across interfaces that had been designed to accommodate their anatomy. In the engineering section, I passed a team of Drathani consultants, my own species, working alongside human engineers on a shield calibration project. I stopped and stared at them. They stared back. "You are Drathani," I said stupidly. "Yes, counselor," one of them replied. "We have been here for 4 years. 4 years, members of my own species, working aboard a human warship, and I had not known." Nobody had known, or perhaps nobody had asked. Commander Moore saw my expression and offered a small explanation. Director Grant, when she first joined the Concorde, spent her first 3 years reaching out to lower-tier species through unofficial channels. She offered partnerships, technology sharing, cultural exchange, research collaborations, not through formal Concorde mechanisms, which would have drawn attention, but through private diplomatic contacts, species to species, person to person. "How many species are represented aboard this ship?" I asked. 14, Moore said, "not counting the humans." I stopped walking. 14 species, working together aboard a single vessel, outside the Concorde framework, without anyone in the upper tiers knowing about it. The Titans were not just human ships. They were the ships the galaxy should have built together, constructed by the only species stubborn enough to do it when no one else would. That evening, Admiral Carr hosted a small dinner in the officers' mess. The food was human cuisine, simple and well prepared, and the conversation was easier than I had expected. Carr was a reserved man, but not a cold one. He spoke about the Hercules with the quiet pride of a builder who had poured years of his life into something he believed in. After dinner, I found Eleanor Grant standing alone in an observation lounge on the ship's upper deck. The room had a panoramic viewport that looked out into open space. Stars stretched to every horizon, dense and bright, and the distant glow of a nebula painted the darkness with streaks of blue and violet. She was drinking coffee. Of course she was. "Director," I said. She turned. "Chancellor, now, actually. The Federation promoted me after the emergence. But please, Counselor, call me Eleanor." I joined her at the viewport. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two beings from different worlds looking at the same stars. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for 6 months, growing heavier with each passing day. "Were you afraid? In those 11 years building all of this in secret, were you afraid that we would discover what you were doing and try to stop you before you were ready?" She took a sip of her coffee. She did not answer immediately. I appreciated that. It meant she was giving the question the weight it deserved, rather than offering a prepared response. "Every single day," she said finally. "Every morning I woke up and calculated the odds that today would be the day someone looked too closely. Every time I filed a petition for reclassification, I knew that if anyone on the classification committee decided to conduct an actual review instead of just rubber stamping the denial, they might start asking questions we were not ready to answer. Every diplomatic reception I attended, every conversation I had with you or Zethran or any of the senior counselors, I was watching for the moment when suspicion would override complacency." She turned to face me. Her dark eyes were steady, but there was something in them that I had never seen before. Tiredness, perhaps, or the particular kind of relief that comes after carrying something heavy for a very long time, and finally being allowed to set it down. "But we studied your council very carefully, Counselor. We studied every species, every leader, every power dynamic, and we understood something that I think the Concord itself had forgotten. You had been at the top for so long, unchallenged for so many centuries, that you had stopped being afraid. And a civilization that is not afraid does not act on fear. It does not investigate. It does not question. It rests on its assumptions and trusts the system to protect it." She looked back at the stars. "Your complacency was our shield, not armor, not weapons, not stealth technology or sensor countermeasures, just the simple, reliable fact that powerful beings do not look down. They do not examine what they have already decided is beneath them. We sat in row 97 for 11 years, and not once did anyone in this galaxy think to wonder what we were doing when we were not in that room." I had no response. Not because I disagreed, but because every word she said was true, and the truth was a mirror I was not entirely comfortable looking into. We stood together in silence for a long while after that, two representatives of two very different species, watching the stars turn slowly through the viewport of a ship that should have been impossible. I left the Hercules the next morning. As my shuttle pulled away and the vast hull of the Titan-class warship receded into the distance, I looked out the rear viewport and watched it shrink from a landscape to a shape to a point of darkness against the stars, and I thought about what the galaxy had been before the emergence, and what it was becoming now, and the difference between the two. Before the emergence, the galaxy was stable, ordered, predictable. Power sat where power had always sat, and the rest of us arranged ourselves around it like planets orbiting a fixed star. It was comfortable, it was familiar, and it was slowly, quietly, invisibly rotting from within, not from corruption or malice, but from the simple weight of a system that had stopped questioning itself. Now the galaxy was something else, uncertain, turbulent, alive in a way that it had not been in millennia. The Reform Commission was meeting daily, debating not just how to reclassify species, but whether classification itself should exist. Lower-tier civilizations were forming new alliances, new partnerships, new collaborations that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The Valith were furious. The Orevan were adapting, as hive minds tend to do. And everywhere, in every corridor and council chamber and diplomatic reception, people were talking. Not the careful, guarded conversations of a hierarchy maintaining itself, but the energetic, messy, unpredictable conversations of a community trying to figure out what comes next. I returned to my quarters, sat down at my desk, and began writing. I have served the Concord for 40 cycles. I have watched empires stagnate and civilizations fade into comfortable irrelevance. I have sat in the same chamber, in the same chair, making the same assumptions, For so long that I forgot assumptions were what they were. I thought they were facts. I thought the galaxy was fixed, its powers permanent, its structure eternal. Then the humans came. They came with 48 corvettes and a smile. They sat in the back row and filed their petitions and ate their oatmeal and said thank you when we told them no. They did this for 11 years. And behind that patience, behind that calm, behind that unshakable willingness to be underestimated, they built something that none of us imagined was possible. Not because the technology was beyond our comprehension, not because the resources were beyond our reach, but because the idea was beyond our imagination. The idea that a species with nothing could look at a galaxy that had everything and say, quietly to themselves, we can do better, and then actually do it. I thought I understood power. I spent my life studying it, navigating it, wielding it in the careful, measured way that diplomats do. But Eleanor Grant taught me something that the galaxy had forgotten. Something so simple that we had all overlooked it. The way you overlook the ground beneath your feet because it has always been there. Power is not the ability to make others afraid. It is the ability to change what others believe is possible. For 4,000 years, the galaxy believed that the hierarchy was permanent, that the strong would always rule, that the weak would always accept their place. Humanity did not argue with that belief. They did not protest it, or fight it, or try to reform it from within. They simply made it irrelevant. 6 ships, 19 kilometers long, crewed by 14 species, built in silence, launched in patience, and deployed with a precision that turned the entire galactic order on its head without a single weapon being fired. And now that the Titans walk among the stars, nothing will ever be impossible again. I set down my pen and looked out the viewport of my quarters. Somewhere out there, beyond the station walls, beyond the sensor networks and trade routes and political boundaries, 6 dark shapes moved through the void, watching, waiting, not threatening, but promising. Promising that the galaxy could be more than what it had settled for, that the future belonged not to those who held power the longest, but to those who had the courage to imagine a different kind of strength. I thought of Eleanor Grant, sitting in row 97 for 11 years, drinking her coffee, filing her petitions, and smiling. I smiled too. For the first time in 40 cycles, I was looking forward to what came next.